Hello, welcome to Dialogue from the Woodrow Wilson Center, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. I'm Jennifer Turner, your host for today's program. Illegal wildlife trafficking is the third largest illegal trade in the world after drugs and human trafficking, involving $20 billion in global trade each year. In comparison to the concerns about climate change and the weak global economy, animal trafficking seems to be a forgotten crisis, and the cost of inaction has been high on species survival and ecological health. Illegal wildlife traffickers are difficult to track down, and globally the resources to halt this illegal trade are a fraction of what is devoted to the drug trade. However, the tide may be shifting, due in part to a unique forensics lab created by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This lab is a CSI for wildlife, and here to talk about this lab and the staggering scope of supply and demand for wildlife and animal parts is my guest, Dr. Laurel A. Nemi, an international consultant specializing in natural resource management and author of Animal Investigators: How the World's First Wildlife Forensics Lab is Solving Crimes and Saving Endangered Species. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, the title of your book suggests that the scope of the problem requires a sophisticated scientific response. But before we delve into the major role of the forensics lab, I really wanted you to talk a little bit about, the scope and the magnitude of the problem. I mean, your book talks about wildlife blood diamonds and the rather seedy underground, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't know about.
Well, wildlife trafficking is really big. You had said it's about $20 billion worth of illicit contraband a year, and of course we don't actually know the true number because traffickers aren't reporting their sales figures, but it's big, and it ranks third, just as you said, as the third largest black market crime in the world. And it involves almost every country and almost every type of rare and endangered animal, because typically if it's rare, people will want it, and the more people want it, the more willing someone is to sell it, whatever the law. So it can go from the petty criminal, out to make a quick buck, to organized crime networks, to military juntas who use the proceeds for their military juntas. And the reason for the trade is because the profits are so high. A single birdwing butterfly can yield $8,500, or a pair of black palm cockatoos can cost $80,000.
What do you do with a butterfly?
People like to collect them and collect the wings and use them for all sorts of things. Beetles, turtles, tigers. It really runs the gamut, and it runs the gamut in terms of types of criminals, types of species, and countries.
No, but you touched on it slightly, but what are the main drivers of this? I mean, I think in the past we often thought that was poverty, that poor people seeing no other choice for livelihood would harvest what's in their backyard and the forest next to them. Poverty, wealth, and you did mention implied terrorism and drugs. I mean, is it all just mixed together, or what's?
It is all mixed together, and certainly there are, poor rural people who live in remote areas and will poach wildlife because they need to eat. Or, an elephant might be trampling their crops and a year's worth of food, and you kill the animal and then sell the tusks to get money. And so yes, that does go on. And it's gotten to be more and more a business and a commercial business. And so what's really happening is wealth has driven a lot of the trade, because the people who are demanding these goods, everything from, traditional Asian medicine to the most beautiful Chatouche shawl, which is made from the wool of 5 Tibetan antelope and goes for about $20,000 in New York. They want it because it's rare, it's beautiful, it's a sign of wealth, it's a status symbol. It's sort of the new bling.
Oh dear. But now, digging a little deeper, I know that some of the products that you mentioned, that there is also legal wildlife trading, and I'm kind of curious about the role of the legal trade and the illegal animals. What's that interaction? And
yeah, legal wildlife trade is a huge business, and depending how you count it and what products you include, it's about $55 billion worth a year. And in the United States, that is some of the major products are exotic pets, aquarium fish, pet birds, seafood to eat, and reptile leathers and things like that. And the legal trade is very big, but the legal trade can also provide a cover for the illegal trade. And that's where the forensics comes in, because what happens is the laws are such that if a species is protected under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, then, or if it's protected under the Endangered Species Act here in the United States, or a host of other laws, then when you bring it in, if depending on the exact regulations of that particular species, it could be illegal or it could need a permit. And the legal trade, you can have a rare species that's listed in the appendices, but listed under what they call Appendix 2, which allows commercial trade with a permit.
Okay.
So it can be perfectly legal, and you can have the permit and bring it in, and that would be classified under the legal trade. And what that does, what that can also do, is that someone can forge permits. So it might be illegal, but be brought in as if it were illegal. And it can also create more demand for a product and spur, because it's here, and spur more illegal trade.
So it's okay. No, but you mentioned that the whole pet industry, I mean the tropical fish and snakes and things, is that I mean it's a big industry in this country. I mean, is the industry itself that is dealing in the legal maybe also a little bit shady? Do they check into their suppliers? Because I know that, I mean, it's a supply chain issue as well.
You're exactly right. It's a supply chain issue, and there's a lot of mixing, and there's a lot of perfectly legitimate businesses out there. And in the United States, the history is, and the history is sort of all over, is you end up having a problem and you enact laws to address it. And say in the late 1800s, early 1900s, one of our major problems was the reptile trade, and for boots and handbags and the reptile leathers, and that really threatened crocodilian species all over the world. That particular trade, and in fact the American alligator became endangered because of that trade, and all across South America you had endangered species, caimans being endangered because of it. And so you had this reaction to it by creation of the Lacey Act and the Endangered Species Act to put prohibitions on it, because you saw this decline in species due to commercialization of the trade. Same with feathers. We remember women used to wear feathers in their hats, and a huge trade. And you think, I'm just one person, it's just one hat. And while that's true, London auction records show about 1 million, herons being killed for feathers to supply in just, a short period, a couple year period.
And styles change.
And styles change, and it's true. And styles change for what people want for wildlife, and so it's sort of a fad thing where people go from one species to another. And for instance, people really like tigers and tiger fur, but as tigers are hunted out, they've been moving. This lab has seen a change to other types of cats, or like leopards and jaguars, moving to smaller spotted cats like bobcats. And so the laws also need to change to protect these formerly legal species. They're now being trafficked. And getting back at the question of legal versus illegal, is what you do have is movements into legal species, and then those become threatened, or the illegal species is being passed off as one of the legal variety.
You touched on an issue that I was really curious about in terms of the regulations. I mean, you mentioned CITES and our Endangered Species Act. You talked about the Lacey Act, and I want you to explain that a bit, but also tell us, you started going that direction. What do these, we have a lot of these regulations, but clearly they're not stemming the tide of trade, and the lab is a big role in helping that. But what needs to be done with these regulations? Is there some kind of flexibility that needs to be built into them, or to move quickly to?
Well, the regulations are complex, and it varies depending on the type of species, what laws apply. The Lacey Act is interesting because it makes a violation of a state or foreign law a felony in the United States. So the Lacey Act is a really powerful law because it can take a misdemeanor crime of that, say trafficking bear gallbladders might be violating a state law, and the fine might be $100 and end of story, and it can make it a federal felony with a more significant penalty. And the laws have loopholes, basically. So laws can vary. There are three levels of the legal system that surrounds wildlife trafficking. Yeah. One is, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and within that, there are three levels of protection. Yeah. So depending on the species, it might be in Appendix 1, which essentially prohibits commercial trade in that species. Things like elephants are elephant ivory. Actually, certain populations of elephants.
Populations, yes. Not even all elephants. That's a illegal problem.
And, but Asian black bears are listed under Appendix 1. Other species are listed in Appendix 2. So you have this issue. And then there's an Appendix 3 where a country thinks that their populations of the species are being threatened by the commercial trade and want help. So Canadian black bears were listed under Appendix 3 for a long time before they were eventually listed under Appendix 2 currently. So you have this complexity of laws, and what that means is that you can pass off one macaw for another. If you have feathers, and that's exactly what happens, you have feathers from one species and you claim it's from another. And it actually works both ways. So you can have some criminals want to pass off their illegal contraband as the legal variety so that you can get it through customs and you can sell it. Others want to pass off the legal varieties, say pig gallbladders, because they cost $2 a gallbladder, and pass it off as a bear gallbladder because they can earn more money. It happens with caviar, and caviar goes both directions, where you have people passing off, legal caviar as illegal caviar so they can get more money, and illegal caviar as legal caviar so they can get it through. Well,
this is a perfect segue to get back to some of the cases in your book, which were fascinating. I found myself really impressed by these meticulous and incredibly patient scientists in doing their work, and also the swashbuckling field officers out, hunting things down and going after the smugglers. But in terms of the scientists, can you talk to us a little bit about one of the cases, maybe the gallbladder one, about how time-consuming and expensive it is to do what they can do, to tell the pig from the bear gallbladders or the certain feathers? Because I think that people really would want to get a feel for, how can this book be so thick?
Yeah, well, it's incredibly time-consuming because they're really creating the science. Okay. And so for every species that comes in their doors, they need to find an identifying characteristic because, well, let me back up for a minute. Yeah. The human forensics and wildlife forensics are similar in that both answer a legal question. And human forensics and wildlife forensics are similar in that both try to link a suspect to a crime and a victim. Mm-hmm. The difference is that wildlife forensics deals with 30,000 species, and human forensics deals with just one, which makes this wildlife crime lab have an extra job of just figuring out what the victim is. And the answer to that question is really important because in 75% of the lab's cases, that is the legal question at hand. What is it? Because if it's a legal species like a warthog, then it's legal and there's no crime. If it's a protected species like an elephant, then there is a crime for trading it. So for each species where that's the legal question, what is it? The lab has to find an identifying characteristic, something unique to that species. Mm-hmm. So just figuring out what is unique takes years. And I can go into that. I have some skulls then they also, but in addition to figuring out what's unique, they have to figure out a method to find that unique characteristic consistently. So
that can hold up in court.
That can hold up in court. And the methodology, they might know that a gallbladder's acids are the unique characteristic, but they need to find a way to measure gallbladder, bile acids. So that is yet another trick. And then to make it even more complicated, you have to figure out not only, a identifying characteristic for each species and a method to find it, you have to figure out often the identifying characteristic for each part of each species.
Like your feathers, right?
Right. And, for instance, if you take feathers, and I have some feathers here. So a bird has about 5,000 feathers. Mm-hmm. And feathers from one part of the bird, like the wings and tails, might have identifying characteristic. And feathers from another part of the bird, like the chest, might not have an identifying characteristic. They might be similar to several species. So these, you can see, these are from the same species of bird, and they look really, really different. And one's a wing feather and one's a tail feather. So you can see this variation just right here. And if you look at a young, these happen to be turkey feathers. This is a wing feather, and this is a tail feather. And if you look at juvenile birds versus adult birds of the same species, they'll be different. Males and females are different. So if you're if you're a bird watcher or an ornithologist, you would typically have a lot to go on. You'd have the birds, where the bird's living, its flight pattern. You'd be able to look at the bird and see its size and shape. You'd be able to hear its song and identify it from its vocalization, saw where it lived and identify it from its habitat. But when you just have a feather, you have none of that to go on. And so that makes the job of the lab really, really difficult. How you figure out what this is. And
I was in awe of, but you gave a lot of examples about, with the feathers and also with the teeth that were in a necklace from Brazil, from whether or not it was a jaguar tooth or not was
right.
a question.
And one of the things, one of the cases in Animal Investigators that I talk about is this case of Brazilian Amazon Indian feather art. Mm-hmm. And traditionally, the Indians would use these like feathered headdresses and body costumes for their rituals and ceremonies. And they believed that you'd adopt the characteristics of the animal you wore. So you might have a shaman wearing a headdress with 2-foot long, red feathers spiking to the sky, and that would connect him to the spirit world. Or a necklace with 4 fangs on the bottom, and that would give him power and, able to transcend into the spirit world. Mm-hmm. But when this item comes into the lab to prove that it's illegal, it needs to identify it as from a protected species. So in this case, there was this necklace. It was about, it was a pendant with about the size of a deck of cards made from this amalgam of waxy material, and there were feathers, bright feathers stuck onto that, and it had 4 fangs protruding from the bottom. And the lab, how it goes about it is it starts by narrowing down choices with what you know. And so from the lab, it started with size okay. and shape. So it knew from the shape that these were fangs, canines from a carnivore. And from the size of the tooth, they knew it couldn't be one of the small cats. This is a bobcat mm-hmm. skull, so it knew it couldn't be a bobcat because the teeth were too small. And then it knew that it couldn't be a big cat. And this is a tiger skull, Siberian tiger skull, but tigers and lions are the biggest cats. And it knew right from that it couldn't be that big. And these were about two inches long, these fangs. And so they just knew that it wasn't that. So that left 5 remaining types of cats. And so they started then with, size and shape, and then they started thinking about prey type and killing method. So to narrow down the choices further, you think about a cheetah, and how does a cheetah kill? Well, it runs after its prey, so it has a very streamlined skull. And to fit in the skull, the teeth have to be narrower. And it also eats things like antelope, so its prey is soft, so it can use those narrower teeth. But a jaguar needs more robust, rounder teeth, like in here. And these, in fact, were jaguar teeth on this necklace, and they were more robust and rounder. And that's because a jaguar kills in one bite. In fact, that's what its Indian name means, is to kill in one bite. And it also eats a different kind of prey. It eats turtles and reptiles, and so it needs a stronger tooth. And so they took the teeth and compared it. And then the other thing they do is, if you look here on the tooth, you can see this line. It's this juncture where the gum line hits the tooth. And so in a live animal, part of your tooth is exposed and part is in the gum. And so then they actually take skulls and they compare, because the pattern of this line will confirm whether or not it's a jaguar.
They have to give positive identity of the victim, even though you can't, from this one item.
tooth.
But other times they also have to do it by just kind of things that have been chopped up and really small, and that's
right.
That's another challenge too, that you have to also, you get down to the chemical level.
Right, because for a tooth, you know what it is. Now think of a tooth that's been carved, like a tusk, an ivory carving. But picture, now it's been carved into like a little figurine, so you don't have the size or the shape to go on. You have no idea what it is. It could be bone, it could be, it could be a type of tooth. From what kind of animal, who knows? And now picture it ground up into a powdered medicine, or boiled in a soup like shark fin or turtle eggs.
I think you mentioned, I heard you talked at my meeting the other day and said that bear gallbladder bile can go into chocolate.
Yes. In fact,
you've got to try to find
lab, take bear gallbladders. Bear gallbladders can be fresh. They can be frozen, they can be dry, they can be crystallized, they can be powdered, and then they can be powdered, or they can be put into an ointment, they can be put into pills, granular pills, they can be liquid. And then smugglers find ingenious ways to hide this stuff. So one smuggler hid bile in whiskey, and the lab had to figure out first that it had bile, and then evaporated off the alcohol to find the bile, and then you think and confirm it was bear. And so again, sometimes these processes, the processing of the product changes the form or structure of the product, so that identifying characteristic might be lost. And so you have to find a method that can find this characteristic. You have to find a method and a characteristic that can be found consistently across types of processed material. And you mentioned the chocolate. That was another way they hid it, is in chocolate. These scientists at this forensic lab, they're clearly kind of the vanguards. They are discovering every day new science to prove these things. Now, but it's the only lab of its kind in the world. Are other countries studying this? And because ultimately you're going to need probably a global network of these kinds of forensics labs. Yeah,
right?
And that's a great question. And what happens is it is the only dedicated wildlife crime lab in the world. And there are other wildlife forensic labs that are working on this. And what's great is that this lab can develop a protocol for identifying a particular species. And it has done so in how you identify different ivories, from elephant and warthog and walrus. And then other people can use it. Yeah. So other people, the lab has done a lot of the research and has proven it in court. And, it's been peer reviewed and tested time and time again. And so now others can use it, and they do, and that's great. And then other countries have started thinking about having their own labs and have started researching, using the Fish and Wildlife Service Forensic Lab as a model, and researching how to establish their own labs. So the Kenya Wildlife Service is looking into it, you know, in Canada, in Mexico, in India, and a host of other countries are looking at this.
I mean, we focus mainly today talking about the lab and the trends. I mean, but I mean, are you kind of optimistic? Because I mean, besides the labs, we have international organizations working on. I mean, do you feel optimistic that the tide really is maybe turning?
Well, you know, I do feel optimistic because I think this gives us really, the science gives us a new tool in the arsenal. And what's interesting is that this lab has to really always stay ahead of the curve, because the laws are changing, so new species are being protected. So, you know, now the lab has to work not just on bears and elephants, but also on, you know, seahorses and sharks. And so figuring that out. It also has to answer new legal types of questions, as some species are protected within a particular area and not in another area. It has to start looking at the geographic origin of evidence. And DNA can tell us that, but you need a whole range of reference specimens to compare it against. So it's looking at other methods like isotopes.
Now you know, so I mean, we're going to have to wrap up. Sadly, we could talk more and more. But you know, to conclude, you know, when consumers and sellers value animals only for their products that they can provide, wildlife's going to continue to be, you know, exploited and endangered. But I think though that, you know, we talked about some grim statistics, but with the new enforcement and the science involved, I think that we do have some hope that, you know, we're turning the tide, and that, you know, there can be hope for some optimism. And I think that, you know, that's our program for today, and we really appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm Jennifer Turner, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, please go to www.mhzworldview.org, and you can join us again right here next week. And really, thanks a lot for watching.